How do you modify your plans at the operational level when your strategic center of gravity has insufficient mass to achieve your desired end state? We look at the German center of gravity for the Battle of France 1940.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 71 of the Principles of War podcast. This week we're continuing on our analysis of the Battle of France 1940. We're going to wrap up our center of gravity analysis for the battle as we finish up with the German center of gravity. Before we get started, a big thank you to Lieutenant Colonel Robin Davies and Major Paul Knight from the British Army's Lessons Exploitation Centre, a part of their Land Warfare Centre, for helping gather up all of the materials that we're using in this podcast series. And a quick mention of some of the resources that I'll be referring to in this podcast. So if you're interested and want to delve a lot deeper into it, these are the books that I've been using to research this episode. Firstly, a couple by Robert Forsyth, Case White, and We March Against England. Robert's got a military background, and it really sort of comes through in the way that he analyses these battles, looking at not only what happened, but why it happened. His Case White, in particular, I find really fascinating as he looks at how both the Polish and German governments prepare for war. Secondly is The Blitzkrieg Legend, the 1940 campaign in the West by Karl-Heinz Frieser. This is an absolute must, this book, if you want to understand the Battle of France 1940, particularly from the German side. Lastly, Adam Tooze's book, The Wages of Destruction. The economy is a fundamental input to capability. The size of a nation's economy is part of the determinant of how much money is going to be spent on defence. Not only that, but then you've got the allocation of scarce resources, things like steel and fuel, that are going to determine the amount of equipment that you can manufacture, as well as the amount of fuel available for moving that equipment around the battle space. Tooze does an amazing job of analysing the German economy, and it really does highlight some of the left and right of arcs that were imposed on the German government as it was building up the Wehrmacht. As we start our centre of gravity analysis, we need to look at the desired end state for Germany, in particular Hitler, and that is Lebensraum. He was looking to extend the borders of Germany, particularly in the east, particularly towards the Soviet Union. He wanted to restore Germany to the position that he believed that it deserved, particularly after what he viewed as the unfair provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. There was a caveat on this, though. It was critical that Germany avoided a war on two fronts. One of the inputs to operational and strategic planning for any nation is their geography. Germany's location meant that it had a history of being required to fight on two fronts. Germany's OKW was staffed by officers who had served in the First World War, fighting on two fronts where even though they were able to defeat Russia on the Eastern Front, they weren't able to generate the tempo required France and Great Britain before the entrance of the United States into the First World War. This was a mistake that they were very keen to avoid. Hitler, the gambler, up until the 1st of September 1939, had played quite a strong diplomatic game, particularly so in the foreign affairs realm. Before Hitler had come to power in 1933, the Reichswehr had commenced working in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler was able to openly ignore the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, and there were no repercussions for this. In March 1938, Hitler had been able to incorporate Austria into Germany as part of the Anschluss process. This was quite important. It added 6.5 million Austrians to the German population. Not only this, but Heinz-Guderian had his first opportunity to command panzer forces on operations. Despite the fact that there was no fighting, it was quite a shambles. There were significant logistics problems. Many of the vehicles broke down. However, these were key learnings that Guderian were able to use to improve the tactics, techniques, and procedures of the panzer forces and prepare them better for combat. September 1938 saw the Munich Agreement, which had the Czech Republic ceding the Sudetenland to Germany, and Hitler followed that up in March of 1939 by occupying the remainder of Czechoslovakia. One of the benefits of this was it gave the Germans access to the Skoda tanks. Now, these tanks were significantly better than the Panzer Is and IIs, and it also gave them access to the manufacturing processes. On the 23rd of August 1939, Hitler scored a major diplomatic coup with the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. This was a non-aggression agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union. It divided the spoils of an invasion of Poland between the two countries, and it provided a valuable source of many of the resources that the German economy was lacking. He had gambled at each of these points, and he had gotten away with it. The next big gamble that he would take would be the invasion of Poland. Frieser, in the Blitzkrieg legend, argues that the German Reich had lost World War II politically even before it had really begun militarily. And he has a quote from Paul Schmidt, who was Hitler's chief interpreter, where he describes the ghost-like scene in the Reich Chancellery after he had translated the British declaration of war on the 3rd of September 1939. After I finished, there was total silence. Hitler sat there as if petrified and stared straight ahead. He was not stunned, as was maintained later. He did not rant and rave either, as others claimed they knew. He sat in his seat completely quiet and motionless. After a while, which seemed like an eternity to me, he turned to Ribbentrop, who kept standing at the window as if frozen. "What now?" Hitler asked his foreign minister with a furious gaze in his eyes, as if he wanted to indicate that Ribbentrop had misinformed him about the reaction of the British. Softly, Ribbentrop replied, "I assume that the French will shortly give us an identical ultimatum." Goering turned to me and said, "If we lose this war, may heaven have mercy on us." Hitler had been informed by the OKW, the Oberkommando Wehrmacht, that a war at this early stage in the build-up of military capability would be a catastrophe. In fact, a couple of months before this, on the 22nd of July, Admiral Raeder had said that Hitler had noted that under no circumstances was there to be a war with England because that would be tantamount to Finis Germania, or the end of Germany. He told his generals that there had been no need to plan for a war against Great Britain because he would not risk any war before 1944. So looking at some of the dates for the key events that have occurred, Poland is invaded on the 1st of September. On the 3rd of September, Great Britain, France, Australia and New Zealand declare war on Germany. South Africa joins in on the 6th of September, and on the 10th of September, Canada also declares war on Germany. The 7th September, the French commence the Saar offensive. Now, we're going to come back and have a look at the Saar offensive because this is something that I had no idea of. It is a fascinating insight into the French High Command's thought processes at the time, as well as one of those critical junctures in history. On the 6th of October, the last Polish forces surrender. So the invasion of Poland takes just 35 days. Hitler offers to make peace, but this is rejected by Britain on the 10th of October and by the French on the 12th. So the British reject that peace offer on the 10th of October. It is 7 months exactly before Germany invades, and that's on the 10th of May 1940. That's when the invasion of France commences. However, Hitler actually wanted to set the invasion date at the 25th of October, and he wanted to do that because he wanted to deny the Allies the time to build up their forces and to mobilise. Planning work had commenced on Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the plan for the invasion of France. Hitler issued his Führer Directive No. 6, or Führerbefehl, on October the 9th, 1939. This was the plan for the offensive in the West. In that, he dictated that the Schwerpunkt should be lying firmly in the north with Army Group B. OKW produced a plan, noting the tight timelines between the commencement of planning and the expected execution, but Hitler rejected the plan, stating that it was just the Schlieffin Plan again. That date of October 25th, that would actually slip 29 times between the commencement of planning and the actual invasion of France. Some of the delays towards the end were related to weather, but many of the delays were related in time to refit and to build up ammunition stockpiles for the army as it prepared to march into France, but also the inability to come up with a plan that the Germans thought would actually work. The centre of gravity for the Germans was to have been the Wehrmacht, as it worked towards militarily achieving the Lebensraum that they desired. The problem was that that was meant to commence around 1944. This would give the Wehrmacht another 5 years to build up, particularly the navy. Germany now faced a war against Great Britain and France. And to put the prospects of that war into perspective, there's a quote from General Maurice Gamelin from the French army. In January 1940, he said that he would be ready to give $1 billion to the Germans, provided they would do him the favour of taking the initiative in the attack. It was a good thing for the Germans that the French ceded the initiative to the Wehrmacht, but it still left them the problem of how were they going to face up to the Royal Navy, the best navy in the world, and the French army, the best army in the world, with their own Wehrmacht, which was years away from being ready to be able to tackle this problem. They were unable to fight a grinding war of attrition. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the Wehrmacht needed to refit post the invasion of Poland. Combat losses needed to be made good, vehicle damage needed to be repaired, and critically, ammunition stocks needed to be resupplied. This resupply process wasn't going to be a simple task because for many of the calibers, almost all of the entire war stocks had been shot through. These war stocks were going to be replaced by manufacturing. In October 1939, with the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact in place, the strategic objective becomes the removal of France from the war. Frieser writes in his book that because of Germany's unfavourable geographic position in the centre of Europe, the German General Officer Corps was always trying to conduct so-called quick wars to force an immediate operational decision. Moltke had gained such a victory in 1870 in the Sedan Encirclement Battle, but at the start of World War I, the Schlieffin Plan, based on this same principle, simply failed. It gradually became clear that the nature of war had changed dramatically. On account of the enhanced effect of weapons, firepower dominated movement. Far-ranging operations were often nipped in the bud before they got started. They froze in the firestorm of machine guns and in the steel thunderstorm of the artillery. This was followed by a long, drawn-out positional war that was fought in the course of battles of attrition. Reluctantly, the generals had to admit that the significance of the art of conducting operations increasingly faded into the background because the decision had shifted from the battlefields to the factories. The struggle of hostile peoples took place in the form of a lengthy economic war in which the Western sea powers cut Germany off from its raw material sources by a blockade. The German generals learned their lessons from the loss of World War I. They no longer believed that quick wars could be won against opponents of superior strength. Oberst Thomas, who was the chief of the War Economy Staff, made the following assertion: "The mistaken fixation upon a short war has been ruinous for us. We should therefore not be guided by the illusion of a short war in the age of air and panzer squadrons." Gross Admiral Erich Raeder in 1937 drafted a scenario which gives a hint at the thinking of the German High Command. In it he wrote, "There can only be a kind of fortress warfare that boils down to alternating tactical successes and failures. In the cycle of changing fortunes arising from these tactical successes, final victory will then go to the state that has the larger population, but, even more so, the state that has unlimited material and food. Just exactly how this kind of warfare can affect Germany, if the missing raw materials cannot be procured continually, needs no special explanation considering our geographic location." And he warned against the illusion of seeking the decision in a single large operation. The strategic situation for Germany is compounded by the fact that there is no plan whatsoever for how to manage this contingency, which was moderately foreseeable. Sooner or later, it was highly likely that the French and the British would turn away from their policy of appeasement. Fraser describes how just 14 days before the start of the campaign in Poland, General Thomas presented a memorandum that concluded Germany could not last through a war on the grounds of its war economy. At that point, he was interrupted by Keitel, the chief of the Wehrmacht High Command. He told me that Germany would never fight a world war. There was no danger because, in Hitler's view, the French were a degenerate pacifist people and the English were much too decadent to render Poland any real help, and America would never again send even one man to Europe in order to fetch England or Poland's chestnuts out of the fire. Hitler had been waging a war of peace propaganda aimed at the Western European population, and that had been very successful. There were numerous peace demonstrations in Western European cities during the Polish crisis, and this caused Hitler to overestimate the effect that this propaganda was having. He started to believe his own propaganda. Keitel had on numerous occasions attempted to conduct war games to clarify the military situation in case of a war against the West, but Hitler refused these requests as he said that they were an insult to his diplomatic skills. Just how parlous was the German economy in 1939? For this, I'm going to rely on the excellent work that Adam Tooze has done in Wages of Destruction. And he describes that the Wehrmacht was essentially a poor army. And we've noted that the vast majority of troops that invaded France in 1940 did so in the exact same manner that their fathers had done in the First World War. They'd marched and they'd used horses to pull much of their supplies. And this fact never changed in the German army. In 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, somewhere between 600,000 and 750,000 horses were used in the invasion of the Soviet Union. Why is this the case? And I think this is really important because if you are going to be limiting the number of mechanized divisions that you've got, whether they be motorized infantry or panzer divisions, that will dramatically change your capability to generate force at the military, strategic, operational, and tactical level. What we're going to do now is we are going to delve into some of the elements of the dime construct to give you a flavor of what it was like in Germany in the late 1930s up to the early 1940s, so that you can see just how limited their capability to generate force was and what Hitler was doing to try and improve that situation. There were shortages throughout the German economy, but we're going to look at two very important ones: oil and steel. The imbalance of panzer and motorized infantry divisions wasn't because of a lack of preparation. It was because of a lack of industrialization, the ability to manufacture vehicles for the German economy. Germany just wasn't producing enough vehicles, but that wasn't the root cause. They weren't producing enough vehicles because there wasn't enough fuel nor rubber to be able to have the vehicles operating. This lack of resources in the motor vehicle industry meant that even in the 1940s, most of the freight transport that occurred in Germany was done by rail. And when goods reached the railhead, they were then moved by horse and cart within the town and out into the countryside. Between 1940 and 1943, Germany was able to import 1.5 million tons of oil, and most of that came from Romania. They were also able to generate synthetic fuel, which is an incredibly expensive process, but they were able to generate 4 million tons of fuel in 1940, and that increased to 6.5 million tons in 1943. Germany had an expansionist policy, partially to achieve Lebensraum, but also to be able to achieve access to the resources that they needed to be able to function. This is exactly what the Japanese were doing with their territory increases. One of the main reasons that Japan set about an expansionist policy was to achieve resources, in particular oil, to be able to solve the China problem. For Germany, the invasion of France had the opposite effect. After they had secured France, not only were they required to supply their own needs, but they also needed to supply those of France, because France had been an importer of oil. Following the German occupation, the French supply of oil was decreased 92% from its pre-war supply, and Germany was only able to manage with extreme rationing of its oil supplies. Let's compare and contrast with Britain. Britain was able to produce 1 million tonnes a year of synthetic fuel, but it was able to import a huge amount of oil. And in 1942, despite the Battle of the Atlantic raging, they were able to import 10.2 million tonnes. So this is 5 times the amount that Germany would receive from Romania. And it is during a time when the Wehrmacht had 3 million troops in combat on the Eastern Front. General Adolf von Schnell was the Undersecretary of State in the Reich Ministry of Transport, and it was the Schlieffin Plan that was aimed to increase production for vehicles and rationalise increased productivity and lower manufacturing costs. In May of 1941, Schell recommended the partial demotorisation of the Wehrmacht based on the fuel shortages that they were seeing. Those shortages were so severe that driver training was impacted. So to drive the heavy trucks that were used for the logistics tail in the Soviet Union, trainees were only getting 15 kilometres of on-road experience. And this impact on training was blamed on a huge attrition of motor vehicles during the Russian campaign. They also impacted on the output of the German economy. The fuel rations were so tight in November of 1941 that Opel was forced to shut its largest truck factory because it lacked the petrol necessary to be able to check the fuel pumps for vehicles coming off the assembly line. They had to request a special allocation of 100 cubic meters of fuel to be able to continue production. So definitely in the Battle of France and absolutely in the Eastern campaigns, whenever we're thinking about those, we need to be thinking about the underlying impact that fuel shortages were having, because not only did it impact the number of panzer and motorized infantry divisions, but also the composition of those divisions as well. But fuel wasn't the only problem. Let's now have a look at steel. Twos in the Wages of Destruction describes the situation. Already on the 24th of November 1938, the armed forces received the news that in the coming year, their overall steel ration was to be cut back from 530,000 tonnes to only 300,000 tonnes. This came as a complete shock to both the Army and Air Force, which only a few weeks earlier had been basking in a sense of unlimited possibility. The Army, the most steel-dependent of the armed forces, was told to expect an allocation barely in excess of the ration of 1937. As Brauchitsch, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, noted in a letter of protest to the Wehrmacht High Command, the abrupt and apparently arbitrary cancellation of orders seriously endangers the confidence of the business community in the state's planning of the economy. The frequent inquiries from businessmen in recent days makes this quite clear. Production of infantry ammunition plummeted. The manufacture of mortar bombs ceased altogether in the spring of 1939. Artillery shells continued to be produced, but without copper driving bands, and it was not only ammunition production that was affected. The shortage of building steel was such that by the end of 1939, 300 infantry battalions were without proper barracks or garages. Germany's army had grown so large that it could be accommodated only under canvas, and by July 1939, there were cuts even to the army's weapons programs. The original plans for 1939-40 had called for the production of 61,000 Model 34 machine guns, the new light machine gun that was to provide the infantry squads with their basic firepower. After the reduction of the army's steel contingent, this target was reduced to only 13,000. Similarly, targets for the 105mm light field howitzer, the workhorse of the German artillery, were cut from 840 to 460. Production of the standard infantry caliber 98K was to cease altogether from the autumn of 1939. Perhaps most dramatically in the light of later events, the tank program, which aimed for the production of 1,200 medium battle tanks and command vehicles between October 1939 and October 1940, would now be cut in half. In total, 34 of Germany's wartime forces of 105 divisions would be seriously under-equipped. So this gives you an idea about how the economy was impacting on the mobilisation and the logistics for the Wehrmacht. This is something that OKW was acutely aware of, so much so that in 1938, the thought of a possible war after the invasion of Czechoslovakia was enough to drive some officers to near mutiny. However, progress had been made, and by the summer of 1939, the German army was ready for a short war. That short war would be VII, the invasion of Poland. What they weren't ready for was war against Britain and France. Hitler was acutely aware of this, and he wanted to fix the problem with France as quickly as possible so that a Royal Navy blockade wouldn't be able to strangle the German economy and deny it the ability to fully mobilise. Hence his desire to invade France as quickly as possible. October 1939 sees us in a really interesting space when we look at the way that time is going to impact strategically both sides of the war. Germany is going to need time to rebuild, rearm, refit for battle, and also to digest all of the lessons that have come out of the invasion of Poland. Whilst Britain and France have got time to mobilise and for that blockade to start taking effect. Hitler had already used his diplomatic powers to secure the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, and that was going to be able to supply them with significant amounts of the raw materials that we're going to need, but it still wasn't going to be enough. So time was not Germany's friend. We see a strategic pause, allowing time for the Wehrmacht to ready itself for the invasion of France. However, it is becoming increasingly apparent that it is going to need to be a quick solution. Once they start consuming those materials at a prodigious rate, the ammunition and the fuel, it is highly unlikely that Germany is going to be able to go toe-to-toe against the French and British for an extended period of time. OKW is incredibly averse to one-shot plans because this is what the Schlieffin Plan was. It was the plan to deliver a knockout blow to France in the First World War, and it had failed, and it had led to all of the horror that the First World War entailed. For Germany, the desired end state is the removal of France from the war. But the way that they choose to achieve that desired end state is going to have to be fast because they don't have the means to be able to conduct operations over an extended period of time. And so in October 1939, the search for that way of achieving the end state commences. Where that search takes OKW is a story for the next episode, because my effort to compress the telling of the four center of gravities into one episode has failed miserably. I then did plan on doing it across 4 episodes. That 4 has blown out to 5. But I think we've covered some really interesting terrain as we've looked at the strategic situation and how it has limited the options that Germany has had in the conduct of the war. And so we are seeing the limitations that Germany has at a national strategic level impacting the flexibility they have at a military strategic level. Stay tuned for the next episode where we look at how they solve that problem. Before we end, a quick public service announcement. If you've learned anything today from the podcast, please share one of our posts if you see it on social media, or tell a mate about the podcast. Word of mouth is really the way that we're spreading the good word about the Principles of War.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.